Hello, and welcome to the short introduction to SBITA, which means subscription-based IT arrangements. I'll be calling it SBITA throughout the video. We have a really short agenda because this is just meant to be a quick introduction to get you thinking about SBITAs. We'll put out more guidance as we get closer to the SBITA implementation date. So we'll talk about when this new accounting and reporting is applicable, what is a SBITA and what is not a SBITA, and what to do if you have them. We'll also cover a couple tips to getting started. First of all, when is this applicable? This is applicable for all fiscal years beginning after June 15th, 2022. What does that mean for your government? Well, if your government has a fiscal year end of June 30th, then SBITA accounting is applicable starting on July 1st, 2022. If your government uses the calendar year, then SBITA accounting is applicable for you starting on January 1st, 2023. And these start dates are the same for both our GAAP and cash governments. Similar to when you implemented lease accounting, you want to start your new SBITA accounting at the start of your fiscal year. The new accounting changes how GAAP governments account for SBITAs. So the journal entries you make throughout the year will be really different from what you've done in the past. And our cash governments will be using different BARS codes for SBITA payments than what you've used in the past. If you wait until the end of your fiscal year, it will be a headache to go back through all of your SBITA transactions, undo the old accounting, and then re-record them the right way. We really recommend getting started early so that you're ready to implement right when your fiscal year starts. Now, what is a SBITA? Here's the definition from GASB Statement 96, paragraph 6. And this is the definition we use for both our GAAP and our cash governments. A SBITA is a contract that conveys control of the right to use another party's, a SBITA vendor's, IT software alone or in combination with the tangible capital asset, which is called the underlying IT asset, as specified in the contract for a period of time in an exchange or exchange-like transaction. That's a dense paragraph, so let's break it down a little. But this really should sound familiar because it's almost exactly the same definition as a lease. The difference here is that it's specific for IT software. And just like with leases, each part of the definition has to be met. First, it's a contract. It doesn't have to be a written contract, but if you have any oral contracts out there, I really recommend getting those down in writing. It also has to convey control of the right to use IT software. That basically means you're getting to use someone else's software. And it also needs to be for a period of time. If it's an indefinite contract or a perpetual license, that is not a SBITA. The last piece here is that there's an exchange or exchange-like transaction. Most of the time, that looks like you paying someone else to use their software. Let's take a look at some things that might be considered a SBITA. The reason we say might here is because you really need to look at your contracts and evaluate them to determine if they meet the definition of a SBITA. But here are a few items that you should consider as you try to determine what SBITAs you might need to report. Take a look at your government's cloud computing arrangements. This includes things like software as a service, and that provides you with the ability to use the SBITA vendor's applications and software through the cloud. It also includes platform as a service, which would allow you to use the SBITA vendor's tools or to create applications that will run on their cloud infrastructure. Another type of cloud computing arrangement is infrastructure as a service, which allows you to remotely access the SBITA vendor's network, service, and other computing tools to process, store, and operate your data. Some specific items to keep in mind include cloud-based ERP systems or your accounting system. For those of you that are using a software for your leases calculation, take a look at that software contract because that might even be a SBITA. Some online conferencing tools, such as Microsoft Teams or Zoom or Skype, potentially your email, calendar, and office tools like Microsoft Office 365, and potentially even your online payment tools. Again, the reason we say these might be included is because you have to look at your specific contract to determine if it meets the definition of a SBITA or not. Now that we've covered a few things that might be included, let's talk about what is not included. The first one here is short-term SBITAs. And thankfully, the definition of a short-term SBITA is the same as the definition for a short-term lease, so you don't have to learn anything new here. As a reminder, it is short-term if the maximum possible term is 12 months or less. And that includes all options to extend the contract, regardless of whether you think those options will be exercised or not. What that means is if your government has a contract for an online conferencing tool like Zoom or Skype, but your contract is only year to year or month to month, then that would be a short-term SBITA and not subject to this accounting and reporting. However, if your contract is for longer than 1 year, that would be considered a SBITA. So you really have to take a look at your individual contracts to make this determination. Now, if you have a situation where your contract is for a tangible asset that also includes software, what do you do with that? Well, if that IT software is insignificant to the IT asset, then you would report the transaction as a lease instead of a SBITA. An example of that would be a smart copier, where you have a tangible capital asset, which is the copier, that also has that IT software component. But really in this case, that IT component is pretty minor. So you would just treat that entire smart copier contract like a lease. SBITAs also do not include perpetual licensing agreements. Remember, the definition of a SBITA says that it must be for a period of time. So a SBITA allows the government to use the IT software for a limited amount of time, unlike purchase software that the government can use indefinitely. Be aware, though, that sometimes these types of software purchases are called subscriptions because they involve making installment payments. But if they grant that perpetual license, it is not a SBITA. If you contract for IT support services only and not the right to use the underlying IT software, that is not a SBITA. An example of this would be paying for training for employees or receiving troubleshooting or help desk services. So especially if you have a perpetual software license and then you're paying a separate monthly or annual fee for technical support, that tech support is not a SBITA. Now, what do you do with the SBITA if you have them? We'll take a brief look at our GAAP governments first. For the most part, accounting for SBITAs is the same as leases. The GASB statement only covers the SBITA accounting for governments that are using other people's software, which is basically the lessee side of the transaction. For a government using a SBITA vendor software, that means you'll record a subscription liability, and that gets measured at the present value of subscription payments. The liability is reduced as you make those subscription payments. So just like you would do for a lease liability. You also record a right to use subscription asset, and this includes a few things. You start out with the subscription liability amount. You add payments made to the vendor before the subscription term starts. You add capitalizable implementation costs, and those are specifically defined in GASB 96. and then you subtract any incentives received from the SBITA vendor before the subscription term starts. And then the subscription asset is amortized over the life of the subscription term, just like you would do for your right-to-use lease assets. Since this is just a quick intro video, we won't get into the calculation details, but as you can see, this is really similar to that lease liability and lease asset that a lessee records under GASB 87. Now for any short-term SBITAs, you do not record a subscription liability or subscription asset. Instead, you would just record an expense or expenditure as payments are due. Now for cash governments, what do you do? Again, really similar to what you're doing for leases. You will record a subscription liability on your Schedule 09 or the Schedule of Liabilities, and this will be measured at the total amount of future subscription payments. You are really lucky because you do not have to calculate present value like our GAAP governments. And then when you start to make payments on your SBITA contract, you will use BARS code 591, which is a debt service code with object code 70. And those two X's in the middle of the BARS codes are just placeholders. You'll have to take a look at your chart of accounts to determine the correct numbers that go there to complete your full code. And if you have a SBITA that meets the definition of short term, again, that means it has a maximum possible term of 12 months or less, then you do not record that on your Schedule of Liabilities. And you will use your normal functional BARS expenditure codes instead of the 591 debt codes to make those payments. Now, how do you get started? For our GAAP governments, you should read GASB Statement 96. You'll see a lot of similarities to GASB 87, but you'll also see a few topics that are unique to SBITAs. All governments, both cash and GAAP, should take an inventory of all your SBITA contracts. Now, if you made an inventory for your lease contracts and during that process you came across any contracts that you determined were not leases because they were for software arrangements, gather those back up and add them to your SBITA inventory. I highly recommend working with other departments on this to figure out what type of software they're using. You should also definitely involve your IT department in this conversation as well. Then you need to evaluate each contract to determine if it meets the definition of a SBITA and document your evaluation. You should even keep the evaluation notes for contracts that you determined did not meet the SBITA definition or that you determined were short-term SBITAs and how you came to that conclusion. This is valuable audit evidence to share with your auditor to prove that you did your due diligence in implementing this new accounting standard. Finally, you should start testing and running the numbers. You do not have to wait until 2023. The sooner you start, the sooner you can ask questions and work out all the details so you can be confident that you'll report accurately in 2023. That's all we have for this mini session. As I mentioned, we will provide more guidance on SBITAs as we get closer to 2023. However, we hope that by providing you with this overview, you will at least be able to get started in your implementation journey. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit a help desk. Thank you.